Ukrainian household. And we're happy to welcome back Chris Madison, who's going to talk to us about growing up in Rideout as a child. So we're looking forward. Please give Chris a warm welcome, and looking forward to hearing you.
Well, that's a big, some big shoes to fill from last time. My last story I spent about 4 months writing. This story I started Tuesday. So bear with me. It might be a little bit shorter than the last one, and I still hope it meets the expectations of the committee. This story is about growing up in the 1950s on Regina Avenue, a dead-end street, in a neighborhood called the Rideout. The Rideout went west from Rideout Bay, or simply called the Bay, by people living there, over to the cemetery, and north to Barsky's Hill, where the transfer station is today. The name Rideout came from M.E. Rideout, who donated land to the city of Kenora for the cemetery. He also had purchased land west of the cemetery and north of 9th Street North that he subdivided into lots. And this is my story. From our house on top of Regina Avenue, we could see below the sprawling creature that never slept, steel that sighed and wood that wailed. The creature took the bones of dead trees and skinned them. It was heartless. The skin was then sent to be cremated at the bottom of our street. My dad called the crematorium the burner. I thought it was more like a dragon that spit sparks out into the night. The glowing embers turned to ash and floated to the ground. On days when there was no wind, a thin coating of ash clung to our car. This was all that was left of the skin that had been peeled from the logs. Once skinned, the bones of the dead trees were put in mountainous piles that some days had low-lying clouds resting on them. The creature had many smells. The worst of all was the smell of sulfur that would occasionally engulf our house. And I wondered on those days if somehow the creature had indigestion. There was no escaping the sulfur. Inside or out, it clung to the roof of your mouth, clawing its way to the back of your throat. But then there were the other smells, pulp that had hitched a ride on my father's work clothes, and the smell of freshly peeled pine that lay in a heap waiting to be transformed. The creature had a name. It was called the Minnesota Pulp and Paper Company. I knew this because it was printed on the back of the bright yellow raincoats that my mother and father had. It seemed everyone in the Rideout had one of these special raincoats. Every day when I went to school, I had to walk under the trestle that carried logs on a metal conveyor belt into the bowels of the mill. Only the brave kids walked through the mill property, taking a shortcut to North Ward or Mount Carmel School. I stuck to the sidewalk and was still uneasy. It was like walking into the belly of the creature. Not only was I afraid of the noisy workings of the mill, there was also the mill policeman. Funny how we called him a policeman. Maybe it was because of the uniform he wore. I think his main job was to keep an eye on the other Rideout kids who were not afraid to be on mill property. Or maybe his job was to track down the missing yellow bright raincoats. On my way to school, I would pass Plant's garage, the school bus garage. All the Rideout kids had to walk to school, no buses for us. They were reserved for the country kids. After school and on the weekend, the buses would be lined up in military style across from Plant's garage on mill property, blocking access to the shortcut into town. Buses looked like they were wearing Ontario, Minnesota Pulp and Paper issued uniforms, those yellow raincoats. My sister Gloria and I delivered the Miner and News that was made from newspaper that came from the Kenora Mill. We had to walk to the policeman's office because that is where the papers were dropped off. Our route was on Regina Avenue, and rain or snow, we were out delivering the paper. In the winter when it was dark, we had to be on the lookout for the monsters disguised as pulp trucks, their bright eyes scouring snowbanks for children with newspaper bags. They never found us because we threw ourselves in the snow and hid until they passed. We knew they wanted to add us to the pile of logs they carried on their backs. It was a futile effort on their behalf to reclaim the logs that had been turned into newspaper. Pikerman's store was just 3 streets over from our house, and I spent almost all my paper route money there. A big store that had it all: candy, a few groceries, some toys, and more candy. Sponge toffee, Thrills gum, and creamsicles were my favorites. There was also a place to eat at a lunch counter. The counter snaked around the cooking area with stools to sit on to have coffee or to eat. I never ate there. I spent my money on candy. Hanson's grocery store was just 1 street over from Pikerman's. My mother worked there as a cashier, so I bought my candy at Pikerman's so she wouldn't see how I was spending my paper route money. There was no escaping the mill. It was noisy and obnoxious. I walked under it to go to school. I walked past it to deliver papers and to go to the store. And it made sure I had no need for a watch. First thing in the morning, the mill whistle let me know it was time to get up for school. At noon, it reminded me it was time for lunch. And at 4 o'clock, time to head home. My mother had memorized what the whistles were for: a fire or an accident in a certain part of the mill, or simply a shift change. She would stop and count the whistles, always relieved when the accident or fire was not in the part of the mill my dad was working. But I thought the whistles were just for me. On mill paydays, I made sure I was outside on the street waiting for Mr. Stevens to drive his green station wagon up the hill. Reuben Stevens from Stevens Bakery in Keewatin would go door to door to deliver bread and baking several times a week. First of all, though, he would hand out a Carmel to each of the kids that ran to the back of the station wagon as he loaded up his basket. He only came to our house on mill payday, as that was the one day we could afford to buy his baking. I loved Long Johns, which were a long donut filled with lemon filling and topped with real whipped cream. My mother liked wine drops, pink cupcake-like treats rolled in coconut. I wished mill payday would have come more than twice a month. I was hardly ever inside. Our house was small, and with 4 kids in our family, we were shooed outside first thing in the morning, allowed in for lunch, and back out again. We didn't mind because that is where we wanted to be. No adult supervision for us. We had an old poplar tree that had its roots firmly planted on Regina Avenue to watch over us. Standing like a sentinel, it towered over the other trees and houses that had sprung up at its base. It was our natural landmark that dwarfed even the mill. Huge old branches stretched out in all directions, showing us the way home when we were out playing in the bush. Behind our house was the bush that led down to the Rideout Bay. This was our playground in the summer. We built forts and hideouts from brush and scavenged bits of lumber. Here we would set up camp away from our parents' prying eyes. We would decorate the inside with jars of daisies, make tables and chairs from wooden orange boxes, and sneak out an old blanket to make a bed. We gathered sumac berries for a sour treat to be sucked on when we were hiding from our enemies. A stolen match and a few candles sometimes meant a panicked moment when the fort would start on fire. Further west in the bush was a series of caves that were carved into a granite cliff near the bay. The caves were wallpapered with lichen, and cracks were filled with rock fern and moss. A quiet retreat whenever I wanted to shut out the noise from the mill. If I scaled the rocks that hid the caves, I could see out over the Winnipeg River and the road that led to Miller's Rapids. Along the shoreline was a long wooden discharge pipe, held together with steel bands. I loved to watch the chocolate-colored foam and clumps of regurgitated waste from the gut of the creature empty into the unsuspecting Winnipeg River. Many kids from the Rideout came to swim here, jumping off the booms that circled the logs that were waiting to be swallowed up by the creature. Some kids swam off the docks that were reserved for Menaki Lodge boat shuttles, but not me. I preferred to walk to Houghton's Beach and swim in Rabbit Lake. The bay was a perfect place to catch minnows that had deformities and missing fins for my scientific experiments. But for fishing, we bought our minnows from the Gann family. Behind their house on Regina Avenue were big homemade wooden tanks. My older sister Gloria and I would be sent to buy minnows for my parents' fishing expeditions. Not on the Winnipeg River, I might add. We always hoped it was Mr. Gann that would be home to sell minnows. He never counted out the minnows. He just would fill your pail. Mrs. Gann, on the other hand, painfully counted each and every minnow. At the end of Regina Avenue was a huge outcropping of granite that we called Miller's Rock, one of the many playgrounds for the dead-end kids. From this lookout, you could see all the way to town, or better yet, you might be able to see where the other hideouts were. There was no dense bush to contend with, and it became my favorite place to play horses, either alone when I pretended I was a wild horse, or with some other kids when we were all horses, trying to escape from some unknown enemy. Life wasn't all playing and eating candy, though. My mother was the leader of the Rideout 4-H club, and that meant my sisters and I had no choice but to be members. We were called the Rideout Maidens. No piano lessons for us. We learned to cook, bake, and sew. It always seemed, though, that the 4-H meetings were on the days when a good game of war was being waged on the street. It was usually the innards and ganns against the shamlocks and the crawlicks. We were worried that our gang would not win if we weren't there. We were the ones that had the stash of wild cucumbers that were our weapon of choice. After a day of going to school, playing, and delivering papers, it was never hard to fall asleep. No need for a lullaby at night. Our lullaby was the rhythmic sound of the creature. Wood falling on wood as tree bones were added to the stash of logs at the bottom of Regina Avenue. So that's the end of my story, but I just wanted to point out a few things that were in the story. And Regina Avenue has pretty well stayed the same. The Rideout has not, as we all know, with the mill going. The house I grew up in is still there, and it is now owned by my nephew. And the burner at the end of Regina Avenue is no longer there either. None of the mill stuff is. And it was used to burn sawdust in the bark and the wood ends that came from the mill. Northward School also is no longer there. It was on the same grounds where Lakewood School was and is now the Seven Generations building. Mount Carmel School is, the building is still there. That was the Catholic school. They were our arch enemies, any of the kids that went there. They all lived at the bottom of Regina Avenue, the Catholics, and the rest of us kids at the top of the hill. And Mount Carmel, the Northwestern Health Unit, is now in that building. Plant's Garage was on 9th Street North. It's now called Veterans Drive. And presently the building is a unit for H2O Power, or the Bowman Building. Pikerman's store was on Rupert Road and is presently owned by Moncrief Construction. In the 1950s, the Kendall Credit Union was housed in the Pikerman Building. They moved and built a new credit union, which has subsequently closed, and Missouri Forest Management is now in that building. Hanson's store was on the corner of Mellick Avenue and 9th Street North. The store is no longer there. It's the parking lot for Luby's 9th Street Confectionery. Luby's 9th Street Confectionery is the family home that the Hansons lived in, so it was very convenient for them to go from the store to their home. When I was trying to remember, I couldn't remember the color of Mr. Stevens' station wagon. So I went on Facebook and I asked people, what was Mr. Stevens? Well, I got, my sister in Southern Ontario thought it was red. Everybody had a different idea, but I got from his granddaughter that it really was green. And I also had posted about us getting Carmels and how lucky we were that all the kids on Regina Avenue got a Carmel. Then people were telling me, Carmel? We got a donut. And I'm like, a donut? Like, I just thought we were chipped, you know? So then I started counting from our house, which is almost at the top of Regina Avenue. On both sides of the street, there were approximately 44 children. But that's not counting the Catholics on the bottom end of the street. So there probably was about 60 children. We could have had our own school from that one street. So no wonder poor Mr. Stevens didn't give us donuts. And the large poplar tree that I spoke about is still there. It's the largest eastern cottonwood poplar tree in Ontario, and it's estimated to be well over 100 years. And the two docks that were in the Rideout Bay were owned by Menaki Lodge. They're two shuttle boats with little patrons and their luggage for the ride to Menaki. At that time, there was no road to Menaki, and the only way to get there was by boat or by rail. And some of the older kids in the Rideout worked down there and helped load the boats. And I'm not sure if everybody knows where Houghton's Beach was. It's at the end of Houghton's Road, which is just on the east side of the cemetery. So that's everything. Thank you very much.
Does anyone have any questions for Chris? Question? Yes. Pardon? Can you speak up a little? Thanks.
Yes, she was.
You can take it outside. Take it outside, girls. We don't need any of that. We're running a respectable event here. That's great. There you go. There you go. So on behalf of all of us, I want to tell Chris that... Oh, go ahead.
Not necessarily a question, but I wanted to let you know that I grew up in Lakeside and I didn't even know Rideout existed.
Oh. You also can go outside. Take that outside.
I think that the Rideout, most of the kids there, their families worked in the dads worked in the mill, really poverty line families, big families. Yeah. We didn't get piano lessons, we didn't get swimming lessons, we didn't get skating lessons, you know, so we were sort of a different breed from.
But you learned gang warfare and
Gang
valuable
warfare.
lessons.
Just ask me. I can fill you in on any of that.
How long do those wild cucumbers last? They don't last long. They're so wet and prickly. Is that what you called them? Wild? Yeah. They're the prickly, wet, squishy. Yeah. Nasty. Anyway, on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank you, Chris, and we're all very pleased that you didn't get swallowed up by the beast, and you were here to share your stories. So thank you very much. Thanks again.